How do you address the climate and ecological crisis we're in? It's easy to dismiss plans to get to net zero by 2050 as a pipe dream. I'm Tim Bale, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm keen to understand whether our innovations could help save planet Earth. So I sat down with a few of my colleagues to find out. So Heather, your work focuses on women and girls' health, in particular reproductive health. Could you tell us a little bit about how that relates to climate change and sustainable development?
Sure. So I guess the way I think about climate change is as an amplifier and exacerbator of inequalities. So if we think that climate change doesn't hit people equally, which it doesn't, then it's often people who are facing multiple and intersecting disadvantages who are hit the hardest. And unfortunately, that's very often women and girls who are in a disadvantaged group. So when we talk about the intersection between climate change and gender, or between sexual and reproductive health and rights, we're often talking about, some of the most intimate, personal, and yet fundamental dimensions of people's lives. And we know that the climate crisis increases air pollution, increases heat, and that has a negative impact on maternal health, pregnancies. We've seen links with that between premature births, stillbirths, other health complications. We know that it impacts access to health services, for example, during extreme weather events. And we know that people don't access health services equally. We see increases in gender-based violence during times of stress and scarcity, or during extreme weather events as well. So these are just some of the intersections that we look at when we look at the way that climate change is impacting sexual and reproductive rights and health, and women and girls as well.
Okay, and you've been doing some work with the UN recently. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've had the pleasure of working with the United Nations Populations Fund, UNFPA, for the last 3 years, really trying to evidence this intersection, because as you can imagine, it's maybe not the most obvious in people's minds. So what we've done is really tried to show the ways that the climate crisis is impacting sexual and reproductive health, is impacting gender, is impacting some of these, fundamental issues. I guess what I think is if you don't have bodily autonomy, if you can't control your own body, how are you supposed to adapt, become resilient and cope with the climate crisis? You can't. And so if we don't have that as a fundamental cornerstone of building resilience and adaptive capacity, then we're definitely going to leave people behind.
And can you tell us how you actually went about doing that research? I mean, fieldwork based, desk
Sure.
research, how did it work?
Well, we started the partnership during COVID, so we've started with quite a lot of desk-based research. Just last week, we published a review of 119 countries' nationally determined contributions, and looked at those for any reference to health, to gender, to sexual and reproductive health and rights, to young people, and also, to rights and population dynamics as well. And what we saw is countries are talking about these intersections, perhaps not enough and perhaps not meaningfully enough, but the intersections are there, and they're describing, the adaptation challenges their countries are facing. And as I said, these aren't neutral, they're hitting different people in different ways, and they tend to take advantage of the existing inequality we have in society.
And what can the UN do to pressure governments, as it were, to make a response to the findings that you've got, and what should governments do in response?
Yeah, so I think that we need to really look at climate change as setting development agendas. We obviously need to focus on mitigation, but there hasn't been enough focus on adaptation. We haven't had the same funding for adaptation. The climate crisis is here. It's affecting people. It's going to continue affecting people. And it's not affecting people equally or countries equally either. Some have enormous adaptation needs, and they're very low emitting countries, and they need support to be able to respond to that. And so I think actually being able to see these intersections, being able to see who's really being impacted by the crisis and in what ways. And health is important to everyone. If we don't have our health, we don't have much. And climate and health is very much a growing space. And if it's only going to grow as the impacts of the crisis increase and become more severe. So we need to also strengthen health systems. We need to also, look at the logistics of being able to respond to emergencies and crises and make sure people are safe, make sure people's rights are upheld. So I think that, some of the work we've done with the partnership, we've done more than the review of the NDCs. We've also, looked at the relationship between climate change and child marriage, which increases. We've worked on a curriculum around bringing together climate and health issues for young people who are in school. We've done an advocacy brief on the very specific ways that the climate crisis is in fact impacting the reproductive health and justice of women of African descent. And so actually being able to look at this evidence base, outline these intersections, show that they exist, and show that there are real issues of inequality is hopefully going to help people act, including the UN, governments, civil society, across the board.
Okay. And is this all about the global south, or are more developed countries also affected by the kind of issues that you've identified?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the studies that has been showing the impacts on pregnancies is from the United States. And what was part of what was so interesting and upsetting about the study is that it was showing that these impacts are also facilitated by environmental racism. So people who are exposed to more air pollution, more extreme weather, who have less ability to access cooling stations, for example, are going to get hit harder. And the papers from the US showed that it was women of African descent in the US who were suffering this the most. So another example of the ways that the climate crisis doesn't hit us all equally. Yeah. And really takes advantage of the problems that we already have in society and amps them up.
Yeah, well, what about in the UK? I mean, are there any implications for us here?
Yeah, absolutely. There's all kinds of implications. We've seen floods, we have air pollution. You know, these crises hit different countries harder based on, a number of different issues, but nobody is safe from the climate crisis. It's a crisis for everyone. I've also done work exploring how the climate crisis is impacting people's reproductive decision-making. So,
okay, tell us a little bit more about that.
In the United States, you had a collective called Conceivable Future. Actually, they're still running. In the UK, you have a collective called Birth Strike for Climate, which is now no longer running. And in Canada, you had a collective called No Future, No Children. And all of these collectives were activist groups, really, were trying to ring the alarm about the existential crisis by saying, look, I don't feel safe enough to have kids. You need to take action on the climate crisis because I don't want to bring a child into a future that's so insecure. I don't want to, I want you to make the future of my children safer. And I use the reproductive justice framework a lot in my work, and I'm very inspired by it. And it sets out kind of 3 tenets: the right to have a child, not to have a child, but also to raise a child in a healthy and safe environment. And the climate crisis really affects that 3rd tenet.
Yes, yes, I see. And you mentioned that you felt that adaptation has had less emphasis, perhaps. Why do you think that is? Well,
I don't necessarily want to split them off because it's a false dichotomy in so many ways. And mitigation is incredibly important. We need to do everything we can to act on the crisis, to reduce emissions. At the same time, we need to recognize that the adaptation needs already exist. And they're very much where you see a lot of these inequalities. They're very much where you see communities hit the hardest, where you see the health response, the sort of social inequalities. That's just as important, especially since our adaptation needs are only growing as we do less and less, in some ways it feels, to respond to the urgency of the crisis.
Yeah. Now, in the UK, politically, recently anyway, we've had some rowing back on the part of the government in terms of the means that are necessary to move towards net zero. What are your opinions on that? Do you think that's a problem going forward, not only for the UK, but perhaps in terms of our potential to lead in the world?
Absolutely, it's a problem. We need to increase ambition. Rich countries, have been the main emitters and causing the climate crisis and need to support the rest of the world as well in responding to that. So it sets the tone in a negative way. It's not, inspiring, and I think that it's the kind of thinking that underpins the logics of the crisis, this sort of short-term thinking, not really responding to the true drivers, talking about false solutions, or, kind of kicking the can down the road. We've seen a lot of that, and it's definitely not what we need.
And how do you feel as someone who not only researches in this, but you're active, I guess, in this? Maybe even you consider yourself an activist as well as a researcher. Does it get you down at all?
Sure. I mean, there's plenty that is challenging, as I said, isn't inspiring. But there's also a lot that is. And I'm really lucky. I work with some really inspiring people. a lot of the feminist climate justice activists that I know are incredibly inspiring, innovative, dedicated, relentless, you know, in their commitment to trying to ensure more justice for everybody. And so I think a lot of the ways to deal with some of that paralysis or inertia or sometimes overwhelm is kind of looking to where a lot of action is. I find a lot of the ways that young people are framing the issue very inspiring because they're bringing together, you know, we have multiple crises at the moment, but they kind of see the interconnection between them. Right. And I feel like a lot of activists and some young people too, the way that they frame the problem is actually going to help us get to the roots of what's caused it.
Okay. So we've got COP28 coming up. What are your hopes and your expectations for that conference?
Well, I'll be honest, my expectations are not super high, but I am inspired and pleased by the fact that we have a health day for the first time, and there's a growing sort of focus on the adaptation agenda as well as climate and health. And I'm hoping that that can inspire action. You know, health affects us all. It's so fundamental to everything. We can't adapt, respond, become resilient without it. And so taking some focus on that, I think, is extremely positive and will help also ensure not leaving people behind in the responses to the crisis.
And what do you say to those who say that COP has just become a circus, you know, a grandstanding event? It doesn't really do anything substantive.
Well, I hear them. And sometimes I feel similarly. But I also think exciting things, maybe that aren't the headline agenda items, do happen in that space. People come together for collective power, for partnership, and you know, there's lots of ways that people can increase their work by linking up with other organizations, by getting this sort of latest information about the crisis. So I think it's a space where a lot of things happen, some of which is never enough and is maybe more of the headline activities, but there's other pockets of hope in there too.
And you've attended yourself, so what have been your experiences personally then?
Yeah, so I tend to focus quite very much on the kind of gender and health group, and the UNFPA has a very strong women and gender constituency. And often we don't achieve as much as we'd like, but it's also a great time to connect with other activists in the space, with other scholars in the space, and plan and regroup. So I'm hoping that we can see, you know, progress on our areas this year and also do more work to link the gender and health agendas too. Okay,
so in the end, it's all about progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals and indeed net zero by 2050. Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I try and be optimistic, but we're not doing enough. We really do need to increase ambition, not sort of promote false solutions, and genuinely engage with the stakes of the crisis. The climate crisis is setting the development agenda, so we don't have much chance of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals if we don't take action on climate change. We can see, you know, the increasing problems that the climate crisis is causing globally, and these set humanitarian agendas, set development agendas, set health agendas. So we really need to take a holistic approach because there really is no general justice without climate justice.
Okay, well, we'll end on that note. Thank you very much, Heather, for coming in and telling us about your research, and good luck with it in the future.
Thank you.